Bob Goblin, Big Ski,
and final escape. The illustration shows.
Oh, sorry to hit a pause, champ. Nolix, it's good to see you again, man. Holy shit, dropping you in fucking fatter gift subs, my man. Good lord. Thank you for the huge 100. Holy shit. There's a full bar because you're watching it. Well, I'm still gonna let it ride. If there's anything I start to recognize, we can stop, but I'm not sure.
From the wintry cold. But after a few minutes of picking, he had success, and his cell door swung open.
Yeah,
but
barefoot bandit days, fuck yeah.
Because there were more locked doors ahead. He knew he only had a few minutes left before the guards would return, so he wasted no time attempting to pick his way through the remaining security doors.
No advice, Alex, just to keep yourself distracted. It'll get easier. Sorry to hear that, man.
The bad news was that he was only halfway to freedom. You see, he was still well within the search perimeter, which meant at any moment the alarm could go off and he'd still be caught. At 5:45 a.m., the guards returned, peering into his cell, and this is what they saw. Shiratori sound asleep in his futon bed. But of course, what they didn't realize was that they were looking at something else. A pile of loose floorboards underneath his duvet designed to trick them.
Outsmarted.
Next morning,
Fuck yeah.
they finally discovered the truth, and the alarm was sounded.
They get a duvet in that prison?
Shiratori was long gone. Now, he had escaped.
Thanks to Prime
If you've watched any of our previous videos, you'll know that things aren't always as
Congrats on the huge job, Parskit.
For Yoshie
Really glad to hear that,
aka the prison
You
break
deserve
magician,
it. Hope you enjoy it.
This was only the beginning. 3 days later, he was caught trying to steal supplies from a hospital, and just like that, he was back in the slammer. But this time, for his escape attempt, he was sentenced to life in prison. He would never be with his family again, his wife and his daughter, and all the months of planning had led to just 3 days of freedom. It now seemed he'd be locked up for a very long time.
Until he developed superpowers.
In 1942, in the midst of the Second World War, Shiratori found himself transferred to Akita Prison in Akita City. There, the guards treated him even worse than in
Tier 1 Rothgar.
They heard about Shiratori's previous escape and were determined to make an example out of him. They wanted to make sure he would never escape again. Along with the usual beatings, he was forced to partake in extreme manual labor, made to sleep on the hard concrete floor in the severe winter cold, and placed into solitary confinement for extended periods of time. Now, this was a specially made solitary confinement cell, which was very small and had a very high ceiling, with the walls covered with copper sheets so smooth that it was impossible to grip. In addition, there was almost no sunlight even in the daytime, with the only window light coming from a small sealed skylight high above. This was a room designed to keep escape artists from escaping, and if that wasn't enough, the guards also made sure that Shiratori was handcuffed at all times. Now, despite the constant abuse, one of the guards, Kobayashi, in fact the head guard, took pity on him. Kobayashi never laid a finger and even seemed to check up on him from time to time, concerned
just to make
for his well-being. Perhaps this made life a little more bearable for Shiratori, and it might have even been what kept his will alive all the way to the night of June 15th.
Thanks. Appreciate it, Mess.
Stormy night.
And yeah, we'll do more Yakuza
in the middle of one of his extended stays in solitary confinement. At around midnight, one of the guards peered into his cell and couldn't believe his eyes. He opened the cell door and looked around in astonishment, as Yoshie Shiratori had vanished into thin air. All that was left was his handcuffs. So how did he do it?
He actually just straight vanished.
There were a few assumptions the guards made that did not apply to Shiratori. For one, handcuffs simply didn't work on him. Shiratori was actually a master of getting out of handcuffs, and in fact had several methods to choose from. Here, he decided to go with the familiar lock-picking method, but he really could have gone with any of them. He had thoroughly scoured his surroundings to find anything that could be of use in an escape, and just like in Alpha Prison, he was able to uncover a loose bit of wire. Perhaps it was from one of the items Kobayashi brought him, but this wasn't clear. After freeing himself from the cuffs, he placed his palms and soles of his feet on the smooth copper sheets and started climbing the unclimbable wall. It turned out Shiratori was also an expert climber.
So this guy just had maxed out fucking stats.
Like a lizard. Once he reached the skylight above, he noticed that, yes, the window was sealed, but the wooden framing around it was starting to rot. And so thereafter, night after night, when the guards weren't looking, he'd climb the copper walls and loosen the framing, bit by bit. Afterwards, he'd climb back down and place the handcuffs back on.
Oh shit!
after a couple months, the window finally came loose, and from there, it was just about choosing the right day. He waited until a particular stormy night, so the guards wouldn't hear the footsteps on the
prime. Sax and Resub Sontag. Fuck yeah, man.
From prison again. Now this time, he wouldn't be caught. Or, at least, not in the way you'd expect. 3 months later,
he became the warden of that prison.
Kobayashi was at home when he heard a knock on the door. To his surprise, it was the fugitive Yoshie Shiratori, unkempt and disheveled, and he needed a favor. A stunned Kobayashi took him in and fed him, all the while listening to what he had to say. Shiratori explained that he didn't actually mind being in prison, and that the only reason he escaped twice now was due to the tremendous abuse he suffered at the hands of the sadistic guards. Kobayashi, however, was the only one who treated him with any amount of respect, and so he felt he owed it to him to let him in on his grand plan. Now, this plan involved Shiratori willingly, yes, handing himself over to the Justice Department, where he could then personally make a case for how corrupt and barbaric the Japanese prison system was, and there needed to be reform. He wanted to campaign for change, and in the process, gain his legal freedom through a civil lawsuit. He felt this was the only way he could realistically end up with his family. This, of course, was a super ambitious plan, and as a fugitive on the run, he was well aware of it.
And we watched that a while ago, Sloth.
Kobayashi, the well-respected head guard of Akita prison, to vouch for him, to strengthen his credibility. As the only guard who ever treated him right, he had a feeling Kobayashi would do the right thing. Minutes later, while Shiratori was in the toilet, Kobayashi called the police. Maybe not a great plan. Just like that, Shiratori was back in prison.
Yeah, awful plan.
He vowed never to trust an officer of the law again. For the second escape, the courthouse added 3 more years to his life sentence. Now, Shiratori requested to be sent to a Tokyo prison, where the weather was warmer, as he couldn't stand the cold in the northern prisons. His previous stints had weakened him severely, but he was denied his request. Instead, the judge sentenced him to the infamous Abashiri prison in Hokkaido, the northernmost prison in Japan. No man had ever escaped from this wintry hellhole of a prison. It was now 1943, and the cold was unbearable in Abashiri, as the temperature in the cells was below freezing point. Whenever inmates received their prison food, the miso soup and soy sauce would often freeze up. In this temperature, a handcuffed Shiratori was thrown into an open cell in summer clothing, and he immediately felt the paralyzing sting of cold air. Perhaps in a fit of desperation, he tried to force himself past the guards, but they were able to push him back and beat him down. An enraged and defiant Shiratori stood back up and vowed that he would escape from Abashiri prison, like he's always done, and that there was nothing they could do about it. In fact, he claimed there was little point even putting handcuffs on him, as he'd always find a way to break free. If not by lockpicking, then, well, this. He then proceeded to rip apart the chain of his handcuffs, to the horror of the guards. It turned out Shiratori had another special ability. Aside from his outstanding climbing abilities, he also possessed incredible strength.
This is a lie. Straight up, this is made up.
Back in Akita prison, he could have broken free of the cuffs in a physical way if he didn't have to put them back on. Now, this was impressive,
I'm sorry I didn't see that, but yeah, I did watch the trailer.
To lay his cards on the table like that, as the guards were starting to build an escape profile on him. They knew he had lock-picking abilities, lizard-like climbing abilities, and now almost superhuman strength. And so they set out to devise the ultimate escape-proof cell, one that was sure to be Shiratori-proof. And they came up with this. The new cell had steel fixtures with a low chance of rot. Any openings, even the bars removed, were made smaller than
he can also run at 90 miles per hour. Yeah.
He had specially made solid iron handcuffs.
He utilizes the speed force to turn back the clock.
And leg cuffs that made him barely able to stand. These cuffs weighed 20 kgs each and had no keyhole, which meant they could not be lockpicked. And the only way they could be removed was by 2 metalwork specialists who would come once every few weeks to remove them in an arduous 2-hour process. It was at this point, and only this point, that he could even take a bath. And he certainly needed one, as weeks of being shackled up with no movement meant his cuff wounds were infested with maggots. On top of that, and as cold as it had already been, it wasn't even peak winter yet. Any strength he would have left would surely be nullified by the upcoming freeze. Though
Martin and the Tier 1 Umbrella
cut his already meager food portions in half. And so that was it. Even for Shiratori, this was too much.
Maybe
as winter came, he succumbed to his fate. Every day, the guards would slide his meal through the opening, and he'd be forced to grovel like a dog. His hand and leg cuffs made every action awkward and uncomfortable, with even sleeping being a pain. There was no doubt life in Abashiri prison was absolute torture. Now, fast forward, Shiratori was somehow able to survive through the winter, and spring was coming. This meant he was starting to get his strength back. But still, what could he really do? He was literally in a bind. Months passed and, well, nothing seemed to happen. Then one night, in August, a guard in his office was doing some paperwork when he heard some shuffling on the roof. He wasn't sure what it was, but he decided to check on the prisoners. As he looked inside Shiratori's inescapable cell, he was stunned. The futon bed and
there was 5 women in there,
folded up,
and no Shiratori.
20 kg handcuffs and leg cuffs that would have required 2 specialists 2 hours to remove was placed on the side, and Shiratori was nowhere to be seen. He had finally fulfilled his promise to the guards. The alarm
turns out he was working for the prison in disguise. He escaped like a week ago.
He truly disappeared. But how on earth did this happen? How did he escape from the fortress that was Abashiri prison?
Thanks to the Prime Sketchbook.
Well, preparation had started 6 months earlier.
Thank you, Liam. Goddamn.
He didn't have the strength or stamina to mount any sort of escape, not to mention the restraints he was in. But one thing he did have was time and patience. Every day, the guards would slide his meal through, and while he struggled to eat his food off the floor, he always made sure to save a little bit of the miso soup in the corner. You see, every night, he would hobble awkwardly to the inspection window and splash a little of it on the steel frame. He would also dab some on his handcuffs and leg cuffs. Now, his intention was for the salt content of the miso soup to oxidize the screws and bolts, eventually corroding and loosening it.
That wouldn't work.
This technique of rusting through the iron actually worked, and the first
there's no fucking way that would work.
Saw screws and bolts coming loose,
unless they're giving him like the fucking sort of saltiest miso of all time.
Spring, he was able to fully remove his handcuffs and leg cuffs, as well as the steel frame of the inspection window. But there was a problem. The size of the opening was smaller than his body, which meant he couldn't fit through, a contingency thought out by the guards. What they didn't account for, though, was Shiratori's 4th ability, which involved being able to dislocate his joints at will. With this, he was now able to slide through the opening like a caterpillar. This repertoire of skills, thus surely making him an honorary member of the X-Men. With that,
this
he
is
climbed through a
fanfic
in the roof.
It's like a Death Note chapter.
Impressively, Shiratori had now escaped from 3 prisons, as well as being the only man to ever escape Abashiri prison. Now, good on him for escaping, but this was northern Hokkaido, and the only direction
Tier 1 narwhal
was the cold, snowy mountains. Actually, the prison guards felt that they had the last laugh, because if the cold didn't get him, the mountain bears certainly would.
But he had a 5th ability, the ability to control the minds of bears.
Hopeful, and that was Shiratori's wife. But she was still worried, because even if he was alive, she knew he wouldn't be able to make it back to his family, as the authorities would be constantly on his tail. Which is why she was desperately and secretly hoping that Japan would lose the war, as that would enable the US to take over the country.
I stream daily, but no schedule.
Everyone would likely forget about her husband. Of course, she kept this to herself, but then, a year later, in August 1945, she got her wish.
He's the Prime Slam. His 5th ability, wife. Yes.
The Americans had now taken over the country's penitentiary system, and sweeping changes were being made. And it did seem, perhaps, that the manhunt for Yoshie Shiratori had now taken a back seat. Yet the question remained, where was he? And was he even alive? The answer was yes, he was alive, and living a solitary life. This time, self-imposed. It turned out he had discovered an abandoned mine on a mountainside in the Hokkaido wilderness, and was able to make a home for himself. For food, he lived off nuts and berries, wild rabbits and raccoons, and was even able to learn to catch crabs from a stream by observing the habits of bears. Life was steady and safe, but after a while, curiosity got the better of him. And so after 2 years of isolation, he made his way down the mountain to a nearby village. What he saw astounded him. The streets were filled with signs written in English, the posters and flags emblematic of the war.
And that's how he became president of Japan.
Young Japanese girls were holding hands with American soldiers. What on earth was going on? He grabbed a newspaper that had been set aside, flipped through the pages, and it was only then that he found out about the atomic bombs, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan had surrendered the previous year, and he couldn't believe it. As well as
I said that earlier, so we've watched Ray's Last Jump a long time ago. I made a video on Ray's Last Jump too.
Hunter-gatherer lifestyle. He headed south of Abashiri for the next 50 days until he reached the city of Sapporo. At this point, he was starving, so he found himself a nice ripe tomato from a nearby field, which was a huge mistake. A farmer had spotted him and mistook him for a well-known local thief, which led to a scuffle, resulting in the farmer's abdomen being pierced by a blade. Sadly, he bled out and died, but not before Shiratori was arrested for the crime. It wasn't long until police found out that they in fact had the infamous Yoshie Shiratori in their custody. For
this shit is super fake, no fucking chance.
Farmer, despite his claims of self-defense, he was sentenced to death by the district court of Sapporo. And in 1947, he was sent to Sapporo prison to await execution. Now, to ensure he wouldn't escape this time while on death row,
he was placed
under 24-hour surveillance with 6 armed guards personally assigned to his watch. As for the cell itself, it was upgraded further from the one in Abashiri prison, with reinforced doors, ceilings, bars, windows. In fact,
how would he get arrested for a farmer's death in the middle of fucking nowhere?
Not just his body. Learning from the
It's not like it's GTA RP where it gets instantly reported.
Joints, he certainly can't dislocate his skull. As long as his head can't fit, they were good. The 6 guards were so confident, in fact, that they didn't even bother cuffing him. Now, Shiratori was getting old, and the odds of escaping by this point were looking slim. As his execution loomed near, there was little he could really do, and the guards knew that. They could see the desperation on his face, looking up, searching for an escape plan that they knew would never come. Though, still, just in case, they made sure to search his room every night while he was taking a bath in the bathhouse, inspecting the ceiling, skylight, and any other openings. A month passed, and winter was now coming, weakening him further, and the realization was starting to dawn on him. He grew increasingly despondent, staying in bed, refusing to wake up.
But this was all an act.
The guards. This went on for a while until one morning the guards had enough and entered the cell to discipline him. They flipped over the duvet and he was gone. This was not possible. How did he do it this time? Going back to when he was first placed under 24-hour surveillance with the 6 armed guards personally assigned to his watch. He had in fact conditioned them
his 5th ability, shape-shifting,
from the very start.
In fact, he never left
because his previous escape
he was one of the floorboards,
climbing through skylight windows on ceilings, but also his suspicious yet, as it turned out, very intentional behavior of constantly looking up to figure out an escape plan. Little did they know, it was all an act, and that he already had one, but it would be taking place precisely where they weren't looking. You see, it turned out the authorities were so concerned with him escaping through a window or skylight that they neglected to reinforce the bottom. This ironically ended up being his easiest and simplest escape, because all he had to do was remove the bolted floorboards, which wasn't easy, but he had experience, and using random cutlery and a miso soup bowl, dig his way to freedom.
Yeah, but they checked his cell every night, and how did he unbolt the floor?
Due to A, the guards not suspecting this approach, and B, the floorboard panels being put back in place every night after digging. The 6 guards thought they were keeping a good eye on him, even at night, but with the hole consistently positioned underneath the futon and duvet, and it increasingly becoming the norm to refuse the orders of the guards to wake up, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Placing a pile of loose floorboards underneath the duvet to trick them was also a callback to his first prison escape in Aomori. So he had now escaped from prison 4 times, and by this point, the story is starting to get ridiculous. But
also, the dirt has to go somewhere.
Capture and escape.
Where did he put the dirt?
About to end, because a year later, in 1948, Shiratori was exhausted. He was in his 40s now, and this
he ate it.
One day, in the Kotoni neighborhood, still in Sapporo, as he stopped to rest, a policeman just happened to sit by his side for a smoke. He didn't know who Shiratori was, but he struck up a conversation with him. Shiratori, of course, was wary of his presence and tried to play it cool, all the while attempting to figure out a way to remove himself from the situation without being suspicious. Suddenly, the policeman did something unexpected, at least to him. He pulled out another cigarette and offered it to him. Shiratori was stunned. You see, cigarettes were expensive luxury items in Japan at the time, and the fact that someone offered it to him just out of the kindness of his heart brought tears to his eyes. Not to mention all his life he had been abused and mistreated by officers of the law, with even the head guard Kobayashi turning his back on him. And here was an instance of an officer treating his client with respect and with no prejudgment. As he smoked a cigarette, Shiratori couldn't help but tell the officer his full name, Yoshie Shiratori, and that he had escaped from Sapporo prison last year. In fact, he had escaped from prison 4 times in his life. It was strangely a relief to get it all off his chest, and he was even ready for the consequences. After the Kobayashi incident, he had vowed never to trust another officer of the law again. But the simple act of receiving a cigarette from a stranger broke him. Of course, he was arrested again. But this time, things were different. Maybe it was the fact that he willingly gave himself up, or that Japan's justice system was going through a change. But the High Court of Sapporo became sympathetic to Shiratori's plight, and some of his past claims were recognized, such as acknowledging the farmer's death as a legitimate case of self-defense. They also made note that throughout all 4 of his prison escapes, he didn't kill or injure a single guard, despite the abuse he may have suffered at their hands. At the end of the deliberation, the High Court dismissed the murder charge, revoking his death sentence, and instead sentenced him to just 20 years in prison.
Aww.
They approved his request to be transferred to a Tokyo prison,
where he broke out again.
He was getting what he wanted. In Tokyo, he was sent to Fuchu prison, where, for the first time, the guards actually treated him well. It was a weird feeling. There were all these precautions and security measures in place to ensure that the infamous prison break magician wouldn't escape. But the truth was,
he fought
Shiratori didn't really care anymore. Everything he'd been fighting against, the mistreatment from guards, the death penalty, even the northern climate, was no longer of concern. And he was at peace. There was no need to escape anymore. He finally accepted his punishment, and for the remainder of his sentence, acted as a model prisoner. Just 14 years later, in 1961, he was released on parole, and for the first time in a long time, he was truly a free man. He decided to head back to Aomori, where it all began, and meet up with his daughter, who, by this point, unfortunately, was the only family member he had left. For his incredible escapes, Yoshie Shiratori became a legend, an anti-hero in Japan. But it was very much the opposite for the country's penitentiary system, which had somehow allowed him to escape time and time again. This was a national embarrassment for Japan. But just as preventing criminals from breaking out of the system
is tier 2, monk.
The safety of society,
or
so
monkey.
is preventing them from breaking into the system. Your system, that is. And for that, I'd personally recommend Dashlane.
Oh, because son of a bitch. Does Shiratori use Dashlane?
Passwords super duper easy.
Dashlane is good though. So I don't believe any of this, to be honest. How do I spell his name? Shiratori, maybe? Oh, here it is. Yoshie Shiratori. The prison escapes may have happened, but the way they happened absolutely cannot be real. I watched the follow-up, but the one that really sticks out to me is his 4th one.
And simplest escape, because all he had to do was remove the bolt.
He dug himself out of prison using a miso soup bowl in a place where he was being monitored 24 hours a day. This dirt has to go somewhere. So where was he putting all of this dirt? He just ate the dirt. There's no fucking chance he ate this much dirt. He would go septic. No fucking way. He would absolutely, at some point, die from it. That'd be way too much dirt. Unless, again, that was one of his superpowers, turning dirt into nutrients. But here, we'll watch the follow-up, see if they answer those questions. Because I don't believe it. In the toilet, but they'd hear him flushing the toilet constantly, if there even was a toilet to flush, or they'd hear him or see him constantly going over to the place where the toilet is. Windows, that wouldn't work either, because there'd be dirt all on the windows, and he's being monitored 24 hours a day. He'd have to take the miso soup bowl up, and throw it out the window, go back down, and do this time and time again. He'd have to keep going in and out, which increases the chance that he gets caught. But we'll watch this and see if it answers it. I'm going to go say goodnight to Tiana real quick, though. Thanks for the gift sub Cavi and resub Pioneer and Actor. That's I was talking about that the other day. She's new addition to the team. Her name's Chelsea. Is that a suggestion gaming or is that like a video thing? And yeah, quite a bit ban list. Thanks for the bits, Manic. I'll be right back.
This video is made possible by our Curiosity stream. By signing up at the link in the description, you'll also get Nebula. I assume you've already watched the incredible Japanese prison break.
Just finished it.
As it turns out, many of you had some lingering questions that needed answering. Like, where did all the dirt go?
Hey, that's what I said!
Handcuffs with their bare hands. Why didn't anyone see the
handcuffs could have been frozen.
The miso soup?
I can believe that one.
Had 3 more years to a life sentence. What exactly was Shiratori's initial crime that led to his first arrest? What happened in his life after being released from prison? Was this whole video just an ad, bro? And as a bonus, what's the next Kento Bento video going to be about? We'll get to all of that, but by far the most common question was,
where did all the dirt go?
So let's start with that.
Thanks to the resub Mig,
the scene in question.
Bob Goblin, Big Ski,
and final escape. The illustration shows.
Sorry to hit a pause, champ. Nolix, it's good to see you again, man. Holy shit, dropping you in fucking fatter gift subs, my man. Good lord. Thank you for the huge 100. Holy shit. God damn. Thanks to the bits Manic and gift sub Noodle Boy. And thank you to the bits Jacob. My week's been alright. Fuck, Nolix, thank you. Thanks to the resub Big Mex and the Prime Nova. Have a good night, Falcon. God damn.
Shows him burrowing straight down beneath the floorboards. But how can that be if there was no place to hide the dirt? Well, this guy thinks the only possible explanation is that he must have eaten it. Others have suggested that Shiratori must have pulled a Shawshank Redemption and over time emptied it in the yard. But as far as I'm aware, he was in isolation at all times. So that's probably not what happened.
The Prime Creator.
No, the answer is actually pretty simple. Just as with most building structures, the foundation of the cell isn't built directly on the surface of the soil, which means there was more than enough room underneath the floorboards for the dirt to fit. And sorry that this wasn't clearly illustrated in the drawing, but let's all blame Charlie the illustrator for that. Another common remark is that this video must be fake.
I see. That makes a lot more sense.
Well, this
I didn't even think of that.
And of course, what makes this story worth telling in the first place is precisely because it doesn't seem real. But specifically about the handcuffs, remember, these were cuffs from the 1930s. In Japan, breaking them isn't too absurd an idea when you consider, and I'll quote this Reddit user, that Japanese iron at the time wasn't especially pure, mostly deriving from iron sand, which has a ton of impurities. It's likely Shiratori could snap the cuffs along the weak link. And on top of that, we know Shiratori had immense strength, making this all the more plausible. But what about his escape from the...
Somebody's like hitting their car with a sledgehammer right now.
The 20 kg solid iron handcuffs and leg cuffs after using the salty miso soup. Why didn't anyone notice the rust? Those metalwork guys apparently came every couple weeks or so to remove his cuffs so he could take a bath. By the way, sorry about the maggot shot. So why didn't they see anything? Well, the rusting was intentionally made obvious in the illustrations to demonstrate clearly what was going on. That was my call. But in reality, it wasn't so visible. And the way the specialist removed the cuffs every few weeks was by breaking apart the actual metal. So they never actually paid too much attention to the screws and bolts. Okay, so this one was kind of surprising to me. Quite a few people asked, how could there be 3 more years added to a life sentence, as was the case for Shiratori after his second escape? No, this wasn't a mistake in the script, nor does it mean that the prison keeps the corpse 3 years after death. Rather, the answer is that a life sentence is not what you think it is. A life sentence or life imprisonment can mean, yes, inmates remain in prison for the rest of their natural lives. But it could also mean for a fixed period of time, or until they are paroled. In 1930s Japan, I believe this period was at least 10 years. Nowadays, it's increased to about 35 years. And this may also help you understand how some criminals can be given multiple life sentences, like 2 or 3 or even 10.
How about we just change the nomenclature and stop calling them life sentences?
An accomplice in the Oklahoma City bombing, 161 consecutive life sentences. Okay, then what exactly was Shiratori's initial crime? The one that got him imprisoned in the first place? This was asked a lot in the comments too, even though I actually addressed it at the very beginning of the video.
There's some parts in tier 1 place.
Had enough. He was forced to confess to a murder he did not commit. But just to elaborate on this, Shiratori had a rough upbringing after his father died and his mother abandoned him at the age of 2. And he later found himself involved with a bad crowd, or seemingly some sort of gang, which may explain how he developed such skills as lockpicking, handcuff breaking, and prison parkour. Now, it was apparently these people who were the ones responsible for committing the murder, not Shiratori, but he made the mistake of tagging along. After they were all arrested, what happened was that the group turned on him and claimed he was in fact the murderer, and along with the police beating a false confession out of him, became the fall guy, and he was quickly convicted. Now that's apparently the story, but the circumstances surrounding this was too ambiguous for the courts, which is why he was still sentenced to 20 years at the end.
He's the prime toxic waste.
Farmer's murder, a legitimate case of self-defense, but not the initial murder. So all that was what led to the events at the start of the video. As for what happened to him 28 years later after being released from Fuchu prison, by the way, this was the same prison that was referenced in the 300 million yen robbery that I covered in the Japanese bank heist video, a famous heist that took place 7 years after Shiratori was released from prison. I already touched on this a little with him meeting his daughter, which was a nice note to end the video on, but according to some sources, it appears, unfortunately, that his relationship with her was somewhat strained. That's surprising considering the stigma in Japan of having a relative in prison, and her never actually meeting him before. So after his release, yes, he was happy to see her, but he later ended up bouncing around Japan doing odd jobs in various cities, mainly construction work. And actually, why don't I play you the alternative ending that wasn't shown on YouTube, but only on the Nebula streaming platform? Just 14 years later, in 1961...
Oh, director's cut. The Snyder cut.
And for the first time in a long time, he was truly a free man. He decided to head back to Aomori, where it all began, and meet up with his daughter, who, by this point, unfortunately, was the only family member he had left. For his incredible escapes, Yoshie Shiratori became a legend, an anti-hero in Japanese popular culture, read about in books and depicted in movies. And even though Shiratori passed away in 1979 at the age of 71, his legacy lives on, perhaps the most, in the one place he wanted to leave more than any other, Abashiri Prison. Or at least what has now become the Abashiri Prison Museum.
Oh, we saw this.
Shiratori has been immortalized.
This was on the Wikipedia page.
Display simulating his renowned miso soup escape.
That's pretty cool.
So I was able to end the video this way, letting the story breathe, because new Kent Adventure videos all go up on Nebula completely ad-free. Thousands of high-budget Sonic did Game of Thrones, Patrick H. Willems, and experiment on our own terms. We've only just started, but it's Lisa Mystery, the
Holy shit, this is like
the real war of...
Wait, this is actually like a 7-minute ad.
Which makes this one all the more fascinating myself and revealing the title, as plans can always change, but I will say it's somewhat Halloween-inspired.
God damn. Yeah, that was good. I do not think we watched that, ever. None of that ringed any bells. What might have happened is we started it and then abandoned it.